Hello and welcome everyone to our fourth event in the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Raphael Fezel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Now, some of you may be attending the Talking Animals series for the first time, so I'm just going to say a few words about the format of this event. We will be able to listen to a presentation that will last for about 30 to 45 minutes or so, and we'll have another 40 minutes perhaps for Q&A and discussion after the presentation. Our event will end at around 6:30 p.m. UK time. Now, as always, you are all warmly invited to participate in the discussion. I'm sure our speaker would appreciate your comments and questions. Now, in case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, I would like to ask you to use either the raise hand function, which you would find under the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom app, or depending on your Zoom version, in the participants button, which would be to the right of your Zoom app. I will then be able to go through the different raised hands, or indeed the chat if that's easier for you, if you'd like to write down your questions or comments in the chat. And you can then ask your questions or make your comments directly to our speaker. Until that point, I will be muting all the microphones. Just to let you know that we are, again, recording the presentation part of this event, however, not the discussion bit. So in case you'd like to watch the presentation again later, in case you've missed something, you can watch it in a couple of days on our website. Okay, let me now turn to our speaker. We are delighted to have Angie Pepper with us today. Angie is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Roehampton. She is interested in what we owe to non-human animals as a matter of interspecies justice. And Angie has written on a wide range of topics, including climate change, global justice, zoos, privacy for animals, political agency in humans and animals, the importance of non-human animal self-determination, as well as animal rights and multiculturalism. Angie's presentation today is entitled Caring in Non-Ideal Conditions, Animal Rescue Organizations and Morally Justified Killing. Angie, I'm going to unmute you and the floor is yours. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you. Just let me... Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Raphael, for the invitation. Okay, so I'm just gonna start. So just let me move everybody's lovely faces out of the way so I can see what's on the slides. Okay, so the paper is part of a project that is a collaboration between a group of ethicists and the Montreal SPCA. And so the project, the bigger project is to kind of think about the ethical dimensions involved in rescuing animals and the ethical dimensions involved in the operations, the daily operations of animal shelters. And so this paper is really concerned with the ethics of killing shelter animals in open admission shelters. So these are shelters that have to take everybody who comes to their door in, right? So they can't turn animals away. And so what I want to do is put forward a rights-based framework for thinking about the ethics of killing in these open admission shelters. And I'm especially kind of interested in capturing the nature of the wrong done to healthy animals or otherwise adoptable animals who are killed really because there's a lack of resources. So when shelters just don't have the time or the money to rescue and care for everybody who's in need. And so I kind of want to think through the nature of the wrong done to those animals. And I'm also interested in trying to kind of come up with an account which fits with the testimony of shelter workers who report distress and anger and frustration at the this kind of tragedy that they're sort of permanently locked into. I should just say that this paper is not supposed to be a kind of offer a justification or a defense of the killing of these animals. It is wrong, and it is always wrong, but rather what I'm trying to do is get to the bottom of exactly who is responsible for the wrong that's done, and to kind of challenge the sort of dominant narrative in the public discourse that somehow it's the shelters who are responsible for the killing of animals who are healthy or otherwise adoptable. And I should just say that everything I'm talking about here doesn't kind of refer to the practices of the Montreal SPCA. I'm interested in open admission shelters more generally, and the views that I express here are my own, right? And so not theirs. Or anyone else's in the project. Okay, good. So that's sort of the background and the aim of the project. So just as an outline of the talk, first off, I'm going to say something about the right not to be killed and the right to be rescued, which is central to this argument and central to the kind of the tragic predicament that shelter workers often find themselves in open admission shelters. I'm then going to introduce a tripartite distinction in the ethics of killing. And then I'm going to try to map this distinction onto the killing practices in animal shelters and sort of talk through when killing is unjustified or justified and why. And then I'm going to say something about who bears the responsibility for what I take to be killing that violates the rights of non-human animals in animal shelters. And I'm going to be suggesting that it is us, right, that we have a political responsibility for the wrong that is done. And then I'm just going to finish by concluding. So hopefully you've got a sense of the structure of the talk. So let's crack on. So many workers who are employed in open admission shelters, I think, are locked into a tragedy that is not of their own making. So this is a central claim of the paper. And what I mean by this is that they're kind of routinely and unavoidably confronted with the tragic choice of either killing animals who have a significant interest in continuing to live, or failing to rescue animals that they are tasked with protecting, right? So they've got all of these animals who are in need of assistance, and they just don't have the time or resources to care for everybody who needs to be cared for. Now, in order for this tragic predicament to get off the ground, it needs to be the case that animals have two rights. They need to have a right not to be killed, because otherwise the shelters wouldn't be doing, or there wouldn't be anything wrong with shelter workers killing animals, right? So because they wouldn't have a right not to be killed. And they also need to have a right to be rescued, because otherwise shelters could just turn them away, right? Or just refuse to take them in or release them. So so I don't want to say too much about these two rights. So I'm going to assume that I'm amongst friends and just kind of briefly give some reasons why we might think that animals have these two rights. So I think that the right not to be killed is going to protect. So I'm kind of operating with a rights-based account, an interest-based account of rights, which basically holds that you have a right to something if you have a significant interest in it, and that significant interest is sufficient to place others under a duty to respect that interest. So I think that animals have a significant interest in continuing to live. And we might think this because death is harmful to them insofar as it deprives them of all of the good things that life has to offer. So that's a kind of simple deprivation account of the badness of death for non-human animals, and that would be why. And so they have this interest in continuing to live because death deprives them of the good things that life has to offer. So I'm not going to say too much about that. I mean, there are lots of other grounds that you might offer for this interest that animals have in continued life, and I think a lot of them are quite compelling, but a deprivationist view, I think, is probably sufficient for our purposes today. Now, the right to be rescued, I think, protects the interest that animals have in continued life, right? So if you're threatened or imperiled in some way, and that threat is threatening your life, then it looks like you're going to have a right to be protected from that threat. And rescued from it, but it's also grounded by the interest in not suffering. So it might not be that the threat is kind of a threat, it's not a threat to your life, but nonetheless it might you might be at risk of considerable suffering because of injury or disease or something like that. And I think that, you know, it's quite intuitive that animals do have a significant interest in not suffering, because they can experience, so sentient animals can experience things as negative. And all of the harmful things that might happen to them are going to seriously compromise their well-being. So, I mean, that's just a kind of like really rough account of these two rights. And I'm just sort of, we're going to work on the assumption that you find them plausible. I mean, one thing that probably in the longer version of the paper, I do say, and that might be worth mentioning, is that I'm taking it that the right to be rescued is not overly expansive. So in the paper, I sort of stipulate that it's a right to be rescued by humans when the threat has been caused by humans, right? So when in the context that we're interested in, if humans release domesticated animals into the wild, right? They don't care for them, they leave them behind, or they abuse them in some way, or they don't have the resources to pay for adequate healthcare. All of these things are these harms that are threatening the well-being and the lives of non-human animals are human caused. And so at the very least, non-human animals have a right to be protected and rescued against those threats that we kind of impose on them, right? So it stops, or it's supposed to, this move is supposed to block the worry that it would require us to kind of go out into the world and protect and rescue all animals from all of the threats that are out there, right? So, you know, rescuing prey animals from predators and that kind of thing. And I don't want to get sort of bogged down in that whole issue, so I'm just going to stipulate that at the very least, right, they have a right to be rescued when they are threatened by human actions and activities. Okay, so now I'm just going to work through the tripartite distinction in the ethics of killing to kind of set up how I'm thinking about killing in the context of animal shelters. So I think that you know, the first kind of killing that we get is morally justified killing that is consistent with the right not to be killed. So morally justified killing where the killing is consistent with the rights and the rights are respected. And in this case, there is no wronging. And so I guess like one thing, so I think the thing to like keep in mind here is that just sometimes there is a moral justification for killing. It might be, and obvious cases are going to be euthanasia cases. So in the case of moral agents, we might think that a person can waive their right not to be killed if they're terminally ill and suffering a lot of pain. We might also think that a moral agent can forfeit their right not to be killed if they're, you know, an unjustified aggressor, and so they're, you know, threatening your life. And in those kinds of cases, killing those individuals would still respect their rights, and there would be no wrong, right? There'd be no, if those individuals are killed, no wrong is done to them. And in the case of non-moral agents, we might think that their right not to be killed is respected if their interest in life, which is grounding the right not to be killed, is no longer there, right? So if death will be a benefit to them and life now is nothing but a harm. So in cases where they're suffering a lot of pain through terminal illness, for example, or severe illness. So that's the first category, right? So sometimes killing can be morally justified, and when it is, it will be consistent with the right not to be killed, and no wronging will occur. Now, the second type of killing is also morally justified, but in this case, the rights are infringed. And what this means is that the reason that gives you justification to kill an individual is not compatible, is not consistent with their right not to be killed, right? They still have this right not to be killed, but you have some kind of justification for nonetheless infringing their right. So a wronging does occur. So they have this right. You have a justification, which is probably going to be in reference to, the justification is going to make reference to other fundamental interests. But nonetheless, when you've got this justification, so it's morally justified killing, but nonetheless, the right is infringed, right? So in this case, one way of thinking about it is that you're justified in doing something that is wrong. And what in this kind of case, you end up with a moral remainder. So although you were justified in doing what you did, because the right was infringed, it calls out for some kind of further action, such as compensation or apology, or at the very least, good faith attempts to try to prevent similar circumstances from arising in the future. Okay, so both of those kinds of killing are morally justified. So I should probably just give you an example of the rights infringement case. So lesser evil justifications are the kinds of justifications that might be appealed to. So if you know, in order to save 1,000 people, right, you're going to have to kill one person. That one person still has a right not to be killed, but you have a justification for killing them. And so their right's going to be infringed. They will be wronged, but nonetheless, you had a justification to do what you did. And this gives rise to a moral remainder. So both of those cases are cases of morally justified killing. And then the third category is morally unjustified killing. And so in this case, the right is violated, right? So this is kind of relatively straightforward. It's straightforwardly impermissible. You don't have the kinds of reasons needed to make killing justified, right? And so in this kind of case, you just straightforwardly violate the individual's right not to be killed. So it's a wronging. And in cases where the agent who does the killing has no excuse, then we're going to also hold that they're blameworthy. And so, I mean, one thing that's, I guess, important to sort of point out is just that there is this difference between the second and third categories. In the second category, the agent that does the killing has a moral justification to do what wrongs the individual who's killed. This is different from a violation, a straightforward violation where you just don't have any justification. You don't have the kinds of reasons needed to infringe the right. Okay, good. So that's the sort of tripartite distinction in the ethics of killing that I want to work with. And I think, you know, this distinction is the ethics of killing for humans, right? And so now I want to think about how it applies in the case of the animal shelters. So, as I said at the start, shelters that have an open admission policy often operate with insufficient resources in our societies, right? No, not all the time. So it's not supposed to be a kind of universal statement about open admission shelters, but often open admission shelters find themselves in situations where they don't have enough resources to give adequate care to all of the animals who need it. And despite their reasonable and often unreasonably demanding efforts, not all of the animals who they come into contact with can be saved. And in the circumstances that they're operating in, it's often inevitable that some animals will be killed because they just have to make choices about who to save. And so some of those choices are just going to be like, if an animal, particular animal requires lots of care in order to make them adoptable, then caring for that animal is going to stop you from saving several others, right? You might make the decision that actually you can't afford, you don't have the time or the resources to care for that animal who has more challenging needs. So the particularly difficult cases involve animals who are either unadoptable, right? And I'm going to give some examples in a minute, or they're unlikely to be adopted for whatever reason, or they just require a lot of time and care to make them fit for adoption. So difficult cases include animals who have special species specific needs, which make rehoming them and caring for them in shelters very challenging. Animals who have severe problems in behaviour and temperament, such as those who have displayed very aggressive behaviour and pose a threat to humans and other animals. Animals who have a medical condition that is difficult to treat and or manage long term. And sometimes these medical conditions might not actually they might not significantly compromise the well-being of the animal themselves. So ringworm is a good case. It's very, very infectious, but it takes a lot of effort to treat it. And so it's these kinds of conditions that might make people who are working in a shelter be in a position to think like, well, you know, we just don't have the resources to devote to this particular animal. And if we do, then we're not going to be able to save, 10 others. And animals who require very expensive or time-intensive healthcare treatments to make them fit for adoption. So again, I guess I've just kind of covered that with the ringworm case. So these are the kinds of the sort of difficult cases that people who work in open admission shelters regularly are confronted with, and they have to make decisions about who to save. So with that kind of picture in the background, I think that one thing that we need to, so I think the sort of central aim of the paper really is to get us to see that the challenges that open admission shelters face are a direct consequence of distributive injustice, right? The circumstances they find themselves in are not circumstances they've chosen, they're imposed on them from the outside. So they're unable to fully respect all of the rights of animals who need their assistance because they just don't have the adequate resources to do so. And what this means is that they're not the only agents that we need to consider when we're thinking about the moral evaluation of killing in shelters. And this is because the state is primarily responsible for ensuring that resources are fairly distributed. So it's the state that's responsible for not making sure that shelters have the adequate funding that they need to rescue all of the animals in their care. It's also the case that it's the state who imposes certain regulations on shelters. So it might make their funding dependent on them taking in all of the animals. So regulations might also demand that certain animals not be released. So if you think about invasive species, so in the UK, grey squirrels, right, have been a kind of recent example. So the shelters under these conditions are then forced to have all of these animals. They're forced to take them on by the state, but they don't have adequate resources to care for them. So the state essentially puts the shelter workers in this tragic predicament, this kind of continual tragic predicament of having to decide who should live and who should die, right? Who should be saved. And so, as I said, I think that once we kind of think about why it is that shelters don't have the resources, the necessary time and resources to devote to save everybody that kind of comes through their door, then we're forced to sort of evaluate these acts of acts of killing within the context of animal shelters, both from the perspective of shelter workers, but also from the perspective of the state. So here's a kind of rough go at applying this framework to the killing of animals in animal shelters. One thing I should just say is that I've just recently tried to revise the paper to meet some objections that were made the last time I presented it. So this is a sort of new way of carving up or applying the sort of tripartite distinction of the ethics of killing onto killing in animal shelters. And so I think probably one thing that it's wise to say from the outset is that the way I'm sort of thinking about this is that animals have a right not to be killed and a right to be rescued, as I said. And both the shelter workers and the state have duties to those animals, but the duties are going to be slightly different, right? And so hopefully in a minute you'll see why this is important, because it sort of looks like there's a contradiction in what I'm saying, but it's not. It's just that you have two different agents who have two different sets of duties grounded in the same right that the animals have to not be killed. So let's just take a look at the type of killings that I've got in mind. So the first case is going to be just what I'm going to call just euthanasia. And so just euthanasia occurs when it's deemed that death is going to benefit the animal, and the third party acts in such a way as to kind of intend to bring about that benefit for the animal in question. And so just euthanasia, there's nothing that can be done to, there's nothing that can reasonably be done to make life better, better than death for the animal, right, in this kind of case. So in this kind of case, I mean, these should be sort of fairly familiar cases. You have animals who who just can't be saved, and the remainder of their days is just going to be misery and suffering. And so in that context, we might think, or we might judge, look, for this particular individual, life is no longer a benefit to them. They no longer have this interest in continuing to live, and death will be a benefit. And so we get justified, morally justified killing. And so from the point of view of the shelter worker, killing is morally justified because it's consistent with the right not to be killed. They no longer have this, the animals no longer have this significant interest in continuing to live. And from the point of view of the state, it's morally justified. Insofar as the state does fund the animal shelters and it funds this kind of service, then I think that we can say that from the state's perspective, it's fulfilled its duty to animals who are suffering and for whom life is no longer a benefit. Now, this is to be contrasted with what I'm going to call unjust euthanasia. And so unjust euthanasia, I think, is still morally justified from the perspective of the shelter worker and is consistent with the right not to be killed, but it's morally unjustified from the perspective of the state and violates the right not to be killed. So what kinds of cases have I got in mind here? So I think that, you know, in some cases, shelter workers are faced with too many animals. They've got too many animals. They can't keep them all. They can't rehome some of them. And so they have to ask difficult questions about which animals to be saved. And one thing that they can't do for some animals, so one solution could just be to just let them go, right? Just release them, let them, open the door and let them take their own chances on the streets instead of killing them. But the trouble is that for many animals that are in the care of animal shelters, they just wouldn't last 2 seconds, right? They're not equipped for life on the streets. And so from the point of view of the shelter worker, you might say, look, we can't afford to treat you or to rescue you, to keep you here anymore. We could let you go, but that will only cause you suffering, right? So your life will not be worth living. And so in this kind of case, it looks like death is actually going to be a benefit to the animal, right? As opposed to the option of releasing them. And so from the shelter worker's perspective, it's the the death is a benefit to the animal because it avoids all of this suffering and misery that's going to be imposed on the animal if you release them, and therefore it's consistent with the right not to be killed. And killing in this case, right, isn't the intention here on the part of the shelter worker is really to benefit the animal, right? They really see this as like the best possible option for that animal in these circumstances. From the perspective of the state, though, right, they violated the right the animal had not to be killed. Because if the state had organised and distributed resources fairly, then the shelter wouldn't be in this position. They would have the resources to care for the animal. They wouldn't be forced into this position where they have to make a decision about which animals to save. They wouldn't be forced to then think about this particular animal and whether or not it could survive on its own. Okay, so I sort of hope that that's like reasonably clear. I mean, maybe one thing I should just say is just that in the case of unjust euthanasia, I think that death benefits the animal because of the unjust background conditions that there are, right? It's the fact that there are unjust background conditions that makes it the case that death is now going to benefit them because they can't be kept and releasing them is going to cause them suffering. Now there's a different kind of case where, which I'm going to say is where shelters kill animals to comply with state regulations. Now, what this means is that I think that shelter workers are morally justified. And the moral justification is that if they don't comply with state regulations, they might lose their funding. They might have licenses revoked depending on the jurisdiction they're in. They might break the law, right? So if they're releasing animals that it's illegal for them to release. So in this kind of case, the shelter workers have a good reason to kill the animal, which is to preserve the shelter, right? To keep the shelter going. And by keeping the shelter going, they're going to be in a position to save many more animals. The problem with this kind of justification is that it's inconsistent with the animal's right not to be killed. And the reason for that is, so this kind of case I'm imagining is animals who could actually survive out there on their own, right? Or at least would have a fair chance. But yet shelters are unable to do that because they'll be breaking some state regulations, and breaking the regulations will come at some cost. So I should say that, like, with this category, I'm really not sure quite how to judge what's going on here. It looks like, from the point of view of the shelter worker, given that their justification is a kind of lesser evil justification, then they're going to be infringing the right of the animal killed. And so we might wonder about whether we might be a bit unhappy about the asymmetry between the unjust euthanasia cases and this killing, in these cases where it's killing to comply with state regulations, because in the unjust euthanasia cases, the shelter workers don't infringe the right at all. They're fully morally justified because death is in the interest of the animal, given that they won't survive out of the shelter on their own. In this second kind of case, it looks like death is not in the interest of the animal because they might be able to survive on the streets by themselves or in the wild by themselves. And so it's inconsistent with their right not to be killed, and that suggests an infringement. Now, the normative upshot of this asymmetry might be that in the case of unjust euthanasia, there's no moral remainder. So shelter workers don't have any duty to kind of compensate or try to do anything to reduce this kind of killing, this kind of killing in the future. Whereas in the case of killing to comply with state regulations, there is a moral remainder because the right is infringed. So now shelter workers kind of have some responsibility to respond to the moral remainder, right? It's appropriate then for them to feel regret about the situation, to feel like they've been sort of complicit in doing something which is wrong, even though they've got a moral justification for doing it. In the case of the state, though, again, from the perspective of these animals who are killed, the state violates their right because, again, there's no moral justification for the failure to distribute resources fairly. Another type of killing that's sometimes talked about in the literature on shelters and the killing practices in animal shelters is killing animals to prevent future harm. So anticipating that you're not going to be able to find a home for an animal, and so killing them now because you think that, you know, in 6 months' time, the psychological stress of being in the shelter will have compromised the animal's well-being, may even have led to them being less adoptable, right? Because it might make them aggressive, can make them depressed. The sort of, again, the psychological trauma of being in a shelter for a long period of time will have terrible effects on the psychological and physical well-being of the animal. And so you might think, we should just kill this animal now. We know it's really unlikely for it to be adopted in the future. And so we'll prevent the harm that's going to come from being in the shelter for a long period of time. I actually think this kind of justification is just not a good one. I don't think that you can justify killing to prevent future harm. I think that it straightforwardly violates the right not to be killed. And I mean, the main reason for thinking this is just that for many shelter animals, I think that on balance, life in the shelter is going to be better than death. And you never can be sure about what's around the corner, right? A bit more funding might come in, a suitable home might come up. And so I'm just not sure that this kind of justification can work as a reason for killing animals in animal shelters. And again, from the state's point of view, they're failing in their duty towards non-human animals because they're just failing to distribute resources in such a way that would mean that shelter workers weren't faced with this choice in these cases. And then lastly, and you know, I'm not saying that this ever happens, but just to kind of complete the picture, you might get killing in animal shelters that occurs just to satisfy trivial interests, like I don't know, wanting to redecorate the kennels, or because the staff want to go on holiday for the summer or something like that. Like all of those kind of trivial reasons for killing animals, if they're kind of reasons offered on behalf of the shelter worker, are just going to be insufficient to justify killing, and so they're just going to straightforwardly violate the right not to be killed. And then I don't think that, I mean, we might wonder whether the state does in fact have a duty here to regulate animals. So I put not applicable, but this might just be false. It might be that the state in fact has a duty to regulate the practices, the killing practices in shelters. And so if that kind of thing was occurring, the state would fail in their duty to care for animals by not, you know, making sure that shelters were doing, you know, had appropriate shelter practices. Okay, so that was quite quick. I hope that sort of makes sense of these different ways of thinking about the kind of killing that's going on in animal shelters. I think the main thing that I'm trying to kind of show here is that a lot of the killing that shelter workers are required to do seems wrong to them and to us, and it is, right? Because their right, the animal's right, is violated, but it's not being violated by the shelter worker. They are the ones that they're in like close causal proximity to the killing, but they're not responsible given the situation, given the circumstances in which they operate. In fact, it's the state who bears the prime responsibility, and it's the state that in fact that violates the rights of these animals not to be killed. And I guess we can talk about this middle category that I'm not sure about whether this is an infringement case. I mean, so one thing probably is just worth saying is that it could be that the infringement is also an infringement that occurs because of the state, but I just don't think that picture really makes any sense, because we already know that the state is violating the right. So I think the question really is whether the shelter workers are in fact infringing the rights of shelter animals who are killed simply to enable the shelter to comply with state regulations, right? Whether that's an infringement or not. I've got some reasons to think that it is, but this is quite embryonic at this stage. Okay, so just to kind of, you know, I'll just move on to this final section now. So one thing that I'm trying to do here is to give a framework which accommodates this common feeling amongst shelter workers that they're not solely to blame, they're not solely responsible for all of this killing that's occurring in shelters, where, you know, the animals just needed a bit more time, or they needed, you know, expensive healthcare, expensive surgeries. Perhaps they needed like behavioral therapy that would have been time consuming and maybe not even successful in the end, that they're not responsible for all of the killing in these cases. And so here's a quote from a shelter worker cited in our Luke 1994. So the shelter worker says, "Every night I had a recurring dream that I had died and I was standing in line to go to heaven. And St. Peter says to me, 'I know you, you're the one that killed all those little animals.' And I'd sit up in bed in a cold sweat. Finally, when I realized it wasn't my fault, my dreams changed. After St. Peter said, 'I know you, you're the one that killed all those little animals.' I turned to the 990,000 people behind me and said, 'I know you, you made me kill all of those animals.' You grow into the fact that you are the executioner, but you weren't the judge and jury," right? And so one of the things that sort of hope is apparent by the framework that I'm offering is that it accommodates this thought. It explains like why it is that it seems to shelter workers that they have a justification, but nonetheless something wrong is occurring, right? They feel regret and they feel sorrow and frustration and anger. And it's precisely because the right is being violated, but it's just not being violated by them. So who bears responsibility for the rights violations and the infringements and the moral remainder that kind of arises because of the infringements? What I want to say is that in the absence of a just institutional arrangement, all members of the political community in which the shelter operates bear a shared responsibility for the rights infringements and violations. So all of us bear a shared responsibility for the fact that our state doesn't distribute resources in a way that enables shelter workers to do their job, right? To care for all of the animals that need caring for. And whilst most of us aren't going to be in a position to do very much, right? We don't have the power to make the state do the right thing. At the very least, I think we have, as Iris Marion Young says, an obligation to join with others who share that responsibility in order to transform the structural processes to make their outcomes less unjust, right? And so what this might mean in practice is supporting campaigns for adequate funding. So supporting shelters when they're asking for more money. And this isn't about charitable donations, right? It's not that you know, we just give them money. The state ought to be subsidizing them properly. And we ought to support measures that are going to reduce the need, right, for animals to be in the care of shelters. So, you know, supporting measures like free healthcare for all animals would reduce the demand on shelter resources. Supporting free spay and neuter programs, supporting measures that would reduce the number of accidents and injuries that occur to wild animals, making sure that people have appropriate education when it comes to caring for animals, right? All of these measures would help to reduce the number of animals that end up in animal shelters. So there are lots of things that we might do in order to kind of bear this moral responsibility we have for the killing that's occurring in animal shelters, which, though morally justified from the perspective of the shelter worker, are still unjustified and violate the rights of the animals from the perspective of the state and the political community. Okay, so just to conclude then, the rights-based framework that I've offered here takes seriously the very non-ideal conditions in which many rescue organisations currently operate, right? So they're forced to operate in these conditions. It explains why, when confronted with a tragic choice, doing what seems wrong can sometimes be justified. So from the point of view of the shelter worker, feeling that this thing that they're doing is wrong, right? That feeling is right insofar as the right of the animal is being violated, but it's not being violated by them. They have, in the cases of unjust euthanasia, a full moral justification for killing, but nonetheless the right is being violated by the state. And so the framework can account for the agent regret and moral stress that shelter workers experience as a result of routinely being required to kill unwanted animals in their care. And it also captures a sentiment widely shared among shelter workers that they alone are not responsible for the wrongful killing of animals, right? So they might bear some responsibility in virtue of being members of the political community, right? But probably far less than the average member insofar as they're really trying hard to address this problem and to care for all of the animals who need to be cared for. And then lastly, I hope that the discussion here brings into view quite how pernicious and misleading the public condemnation of shelter killings is. And I think that, you know, most of us will have experience of reading things in the paper about shelters who have killed, you know, there's often exposés about the RSPCA having killed healthy animals or animals who could be adopted. But the point is that for many of these shelters, they are operating in non-ideal conditions and having to make judgments all the time about which animals to save. And the reason they have to make those judgments is because they don't have sufficient funding. And so it's a call to like be more sensitive to precisely what the causes are of the moral problem that they face. And that's it. Thank you.